The kingdom of Nkora stretched across the red earth plains like an ancient memory carved into the land. At sunrise, the sky burned gold, and the light rolled over the grasslands, touching everything from the far-off shepherd huts to the marble steps of King Arumo's palace. Nkora was beautiful but bruised. Its people walked with bowed heads. Its markets whispered more fear than laughter. Its streets carried the smell of dust, sweat, and silence. Women pounded maize near their doorways, but their eyes always flickered toward the palace walls, as if expecting another decree, another tax, another punishment. Children who once ran freely now stepped aside whenever a guard passed, and in the center of it all stood the palace, grand, shining, yet wrapped in a shadow of cruelty. The king who lived inside Arumo was a man whose pride outweighed the kingdom's wealth. His footsteps echoed with arrogance. His voice rose like thunder. His anger scattered grown men like frightened birds. Arumo believed fear was the only true currency of power, and he spent it freely. Anyone beneath him, servants, guards, even council elders, were treated not as people but as objects to kick aside when he wished. Some said he had changed after betrayal long ago. Others whispered he was born with a heart made of iron. Whatever the truth was, Nkora had learned one lesson. A cruel king makes a silent country. Inside that palace, working quietly in the storerooms, was a thin young servant named Jako. He was neither strong nor loud, and he never tried to be noticed. Most servants moved with urgency, afraid of the king's temper. Jako moved with care, afraid only of making mistakes. His eyes were sharp, serious, always watching small details. How sacks were stacked, which jars had loosened lids, which herbs smelled fresher than others. He had grown up learning how to listen more than speak, because speaking brought questions, and questions brought trouble. His father had once been a respected man in the kingdom, a friend of King Arumo himself. But one night, after a disagreement that only the two men understood, Arumo had thrown him out of the palace doors in fury. That single moment had erased years of trust, years of loyalty. Jako remembered the night clearly. The heavy rain, the look of disbelief on his father's face, the way guards dragged him like a criminal. The shame never left their home. His father died with bitterness in his chest, and from that day forward, King Arumo looked at Jako with the same cold disgust he once held for his father. The young servant learned to keep his head down, to swallow every insult, to hide every hurt. And yet, beneath the silence, something lived, a quiet ember of pain that never quite went out. Jako's days were simple but exhausting. Before dawn, he reported to the food store, a wide stone chamber filled with sacks of rice, dried meat, grains, spices, and the precious herbs a palace healer used for rituals and remedies. It was a room that smelled of earth, wood, and ancient knowledge. Jako had a special touch with herbs, a skill passed down from his mother, who used to grind leaves and roots into medicines for the village. She had taught him which herbs cured fever, which calmed the heart, and which ones tasted bitter but healed broken bones. He remembered her hands, strong, gentle, stained green from grinding leaves. She had died young, too, and the palace became his only home afterward. Jako performed his duties as if each step carried a silent promise to her, to stay patient, to avoid trouble, to survive. Other servants liked him. Some pitied him. All of them knew he carried a heaviness that made him older than his years. They also knew the king hated him for reasons he never explained. And Jako? He simply endured, day after day, without complaint, without tears, without a voice that anyone could hear. Then came the night that would carve itself into his bones forever. It began like any other evening. Lanterns flickering, guards pacing, the palace settling into a wary quiet. Jako was alone in the storeroom, shifting heavy sacks of grain to make space for the new supplies arriving in the morning. The air was thick and warm, and sweat dripped down his temples as he lifted a sack nearly as large as himself. One slip, one misstep, one moment of exhaustion. The sack tumbled from his hands, crashing to the ground with a thud that echoed through the corridors like a shout. Jako froze. The dust rose in the air, and then he heard it. Boots. Angry, fast, unforgiving boots. Guards stormed into the room, lanterns shaking in their hands, shadows leaping on the walls behind them. Before he could explain, Before he could even breathe, they dragged him forward, hauling him out like a criminal caught in the act. King Arumo arrived moments later, wearing a fury that could scorch the air. "A mistake," he roared. "Servants do not get to make mistakes." Jako tried to speak, but no sound escaped his throat. The king's order was sharp and final. Beat him. Beat him where everyone can see. What followed was a night Jako would never forget. The crack of sticks against skin, the sting of pain slicing through his back, the mud beneath him, the crowd of silent servants watching with fear in their eyes. He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply lay there, absorbing every blow, every humiliation, every memory. When the beating finally ended, he was left on a thin mat in a dark corner of the servants' quarters. His body trembled. His breath came in broken pieces. And yet, his mind was clearer than it had ever been. As he stared at the ceiling, taste of blood on his tongue, he whispered the first true promise of his life. "I will rise again, and the king will feel what I felt tonight without a single scratch on his skin." Jako lay awake long after the bruises on his back stopped throbbing and settled into a deeper, heavier kind of pain. The thin mat beneath him scratched his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind was burning hotter than his wounds. Each breath was a reminder of the king's cruelty, each blink a replay of the crowd watching him suffer in silence. Around him, the servants' quarters slept in uneasy stillness. A few whispered prayers drifted through the air, soft and broken. Someone snored lightly in the next room. Another servant coughed in his sleep. Yet despite all these small human sounds, Jako felt like he was floating alone in a world that had chosen to forget him. His father's face flickered in his memory again, his calm smile, his unbroken spirit. The night he was thrown out of the palace with nothing but shame wrapped around him. Jako wondered if this was how his father had felt. Helpless, voiceless, carrying pain like a second skin. He pressed his bruised palm against the ground and whispered the words again, the promise that now lived inside him like a living flame. "He will feel what I felt." But even as he said it, he knew one thing for certain. The king could not be challenged directly. Not by him, not by any servant. Arumo's power was too vast, too deeply rooted. A sword would never reach him. A shout would never challenge him. Only something subtle, patient, and invisible could cut through him the way he had cut through others. Morning arrived slowly, bleeding into the sky with a dull gray light. Jako forced himself to stand, gripping the wooden wall for balance as pain shot through his ribs. He dressed quietly, ignoring the other servants who glanced at him with a mixture of pity and fear. No one asked how he felt. No one dared mention what had happened. In Korra, survival meant silence, and they all obeyed that rule. When Jako walked into the storeroom, the familiar scent of dried herbs and grains greeted him like an old friend. He paused for a moment, breathing it in, grounding himself. This room, this simple, dusty, forgotten part of the palace, was the only place where he felt even a fragment of control. Everything here had rules he understood. This herb calms fever. That root sharpens a mind. This powder helps wounds heal faster. Life made sense among these shelves, far more than it did outside them. As he cleaned jars and rearranged sacks, he began to observe things he had never paid attention to before. How the palace healer always set aside certain herbs for the king's morning drink. How the healer trusted Jako to carry the ingredients because he was quiet and reliable. How no one ever questioned the drink because Arumo believed it made him stronger, more powerful, more kingly. Power, Jako realized, could be touched, not with violence, but with knowledge. Later that day, when the palace healer entered the storeroom to prepare the king's morning mixture for the next dawn, Jako watched him more closely than usual. The healer was an old man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly from age. He hummed softly as he worked, unaware of the storm forming behind Jako's calm expression. The man explained things sometimes without realizing Jako was listening. A little of this root for the king's breath, a small leaf for strength, 2 drops for focus, never 3, too bitter. Jako had always listened out of interest, but now, every word carved itself into his mind like a tool he would one day need. When the healer left, Jako stayed behind, staring at the shelves. His mother's voice rose from the deepest corners of his memory. She had once held a thin, dark-colored root in her hands and said, "This one does not kill, but it makes the heart restless. It shakes the mind. It wakes the pain a man hides from the world. They had called the plant Ngara in their village the herb of shadows. He remembered how she warned him never to use it carelessly, never to give it to someone unless he wanted their inner demons to claw their way out. Standing there in the dim light of the storeroom, surrounded by silence and dust, Jako felt a chill move through him. Ngara was dangerous, yes, but not deadly. It didn't break bones or stop hearts. It simply uncovered the pain that already lived inside a person. He thought of King Arumo, angry, corrupt, arrogant, violent. A man like that surely carried countless buried fears. What would happen if those fears were awakened? That night, after the palace had gone quiet, Jako returned to the storeroom with a single lantern trembling in his hand. Every step echoed like a warning. For the first time, he was not simply entering the storeroom to work. He was stepping inside with the beginning of a plan. The shelves felt taller, the shadows darker, and the smell of herbs stronger than ever before. He found the jar containing the dried Ngara root, small, harmless-looking pieces of brown wood, curled at the edges like dead leaves. His hand hovered above it. A voice inside him whispered, "This is wrong." Another voice answered, "So is cruelty." Jako was not a killer. Even thinking of harm made his stomach twist. But the herb he chose would not kill. It would not poison the king's blood. It would only make him feel the same helplessness Jako had felt lying on that mat, breath broken, spirit crushed. His fingers closed around a fragment of the root. Before dawn, he ground the smallest possible amount, a pinch barely larger than a tear, and mixed it with the king's usual ingredients. The scent did not change. The color did not change. Nothing changed except everything. And when he handed the healer the bowl the next morning, Jako kept his eyes lowered, heart pounding like a drum that only he could hear. Arumo drank the mixture without suspicion, lifting the cup with the arrogance of a man who believed he was invincible. Hours passed. At first, nothing happened. But then Jako noticed small details. The king's fingers twitching during meetings, the way he rubbed his temple as if chased by a headache, the moment he paused mid-sentence because a sudden shiver ran through him. It was working, slowly, quietly, invisibly. Over the next several days, Jako added only the smallest amount of Ngara root. Never enough to raise suspicion, never enough to look odd. The herb did the rest on its own. Arumo's nights became restless. Guards reported he paced his chambers like a man hunted by shadows. His hands trembled when he held his ceremonial staff. His voice cracked during council meetings. He barked orders and forgot what he had just commanded. Sometimes he stared at nothing, eyes hollow, jaw clenching as if fighting an unseen enemy. Ministers whispered behind closed doors. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Rumors began spreading to the palace. The king is cursed. The king has made the spirits angry. The king is losing himself. And through all of this, Jako moved like a quiet ghost, watching, learning, waiting. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a deep, steady calm. Revenge did not need flames or blood. It only needed time. And time was finally on his side. The palace walls began to feel smaller for King Arumo, as the corridors that once echoed his authority were now tightening around him like a slow, suffocating trap. Days passed in a haze of trembling fingers and sleepless nights, and though he tried to hide it with bursts of anger, even the guards could see the cracks forming. He walked with a stiffness that wasn't there before, one hand on the wall, the other shaking slightly as he tried to maintain balance. During council gatherings, he gripped the arm of his throne like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Ministers exchanged wary looks. Their once mighty king now paused in the middle of sentences, staring off into empty space as though a shadow had just passed through his thoughts. And in those moments, when silence swallowed the room, no one dared breathe, because the Arumo they knew, the fierce, thunder-voiced ruler, seemed to vanish, leaving behind a frightened version of himself that none recognized. Rumors, once whispered, now ran openly like water down the palace steps. The king is cursed, some said. He's angered the ancestors, others insisted. But none of them knew the truth, that the king's downfall was not supernatural at all. It was human, it was deliberate, it was silent, and the boy responsible moved to the halls, carrying water jars and herb trays as if nothing had changed. As the king's strength faltered, Jako's resolve solidified. He observed the king's decline with a calm face and a storming heart, knowing the herb was doing its work exactly as his mother had once described. Yet, even as he carried the morning herbs to the healer, even as he ground another tiny pinch of gar root, he felt no joy. Revenge, he realized, didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ash, dry and heavy. And still, he continued, not because he wanted the king to suffer endlessly, but because this suffering was the mirror Arumo had forced others to look into for years. Now it was his turn to see. One morning, when the healer handed Jako the empty cup the king had drunk from, Jako saw faint fingerprints etched into the clay, marks of a hand that had shaken too hard to hold the cup properly. Something tightened in Jako's chest. It was not guilt. It was recognition. He had seen those same trembling marks on his own water cup the night he had been beaten. Pain, he thought, had a shape, and now that shape was finally reaching the king who once believed he was untouchable. But Arumo did not suffer in silence. His frustration erupted in violent storms that shook the palace. He threw goblets at servants, screamed at guards for imagined mistakes, accused ministers of plotting betrayal. At one point, he demanded that the palace healer be replaced because his hands smelled of witchcraft. The healer, though old and weary, tried to calm him, insisting the herbal drink was the same mixture he had taken for years. But Arumo would not listen. He barely listened to anything. Every night, he woke gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, claiming that dark figure stood near his bed. His nightmares spilled into daytime, making him flinch at shadows on the walls and jump at the sound of pots clanking in the kitchen. The king who once stood tall and fearless now walked as though hunted by ghosts only he could see. And all the while, Jako continued his routine, grinding herbs with steady hands. He never changed the dosage. He never increased the root. The herb was doing exactly what it was meant to do, revealed a monster that already lived inside the king. Meanwhile, the palace staff, maids, guards, ministers, watched the transformation with a mixture of fear and hidden relief. A cruel king losing control was still dangerous, but also meant the tight fist around their lives was loosening. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the kingdom, Arumo attempted to walk to the courtyard to observe the guards' training. It was something he had done for years, a show of strength, a reminder that he was the kingdom's spine. But that evening became the moment the entire palace realized something was terribly wrong. He stepped forward, lifted his chin, tried to force the old authority back into his posture. But after only a few steps, his knees buckled. The courtyard stones rushed up to meet him. Gasps erupted from every direction. Guards rushed to his side. Ministers ran over, their robes dragging in the dust. The king groaned, clutching his chest, eyes wide with panic. Someone shouted for the healer. Someone else whispered, "This is a sign." And Jako, who had been refilling water jars nearby, froze, his heart thundering in his chest. He had seen Arumo weaken before, but this was different. This was collapse. The healer arrived breathlessly, kneeling beside the king and checking his pulse, his breath, his eyes. Then the old man leaned close to the king's mouth and sniffed the lingering bitterness of the herbs. His face tightened. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, filled with suspicion and fear. "Something is wrong," he murmured. "Something in his drink." The courtyard erupted in confusion. Arumo's voice tore through it like a whip. "Someone is trying to destroy me. Someone in this palace." He pointed a trembling finger at guards, at ministers, at anyone his frightened mind could reach. And in that chaos, Jako felt a coldness crawl down his spine. The secret, once hidden, was beginning to breathe. That night was a turning point. The healer demanded a full inspection of the ingredients used in the king's daily drink. The council gathered in the storeroom, their lanterns casting uneven light across shelves of herbs. Jako stood among them, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. The healer opened jars, sniffed roots, rubbed powders between his fingers. Then he reached the jar in Dara. His eyes narrowed. He lifted a small piece to his nose, inhaled gently, and looked at the council with a grave expression. "This," he said softly, wakes the darkness inside a man. It is not poison, but it can break even the strongest mind if used repeatedly. A murmur spread through the room. Someone asked who had access to the herbs. Another asked who prepared the mixture each morning. And slowly, too slowly for Jako to escape, the attention shifted toward him. After all, he was the boy who always managed the storeroom. He was the one who fetched herbs for the healer. He was the one who brought the mixture every morning. Arumo, upon hearing the whispers, demanded Jako be brought to him immediately. The guards dragged him to court, though this time there were no jeering crowds, no cruel orders shouted in triumph. Instead, there was confusion, fear, a kingdom trembling under the weight of a truth it had not expected. Jako stood before the king, not as a broken boy, not as a voiceless servant, but as the silent force behind the king's unraveling. The palace held its breath. The story was no longer just about pain. It was about revelation. The news of King Arumo's sudden collapse spread to the palace like a struck bell, vibrating through stone, air, and spine. Jako walked beside the guards, not as a prisoner, not as a threat, but as a quiet witness to a truth that had finally grown too large to hide. The courtyard was already full when they arrived. Golden banners flapped against a restless wind, and the stone floor beneath the king's fallen body looked like it had been waiting for this moment for years. King Arumo was on his knees, breathing in loud, broken gasps as though the air itself now refused to obey him. His hands trembled, his jaw twitched uncontrollably, and his eyes darted around like a caged animal searching for an escape that did not exist. The council members surrounded him in a half-circle, robes heavy, brows furrowed, and faces torn between disbelief and a dawning, unavoidable understanding. Citizens pressed against the courtyard gates, whispering prayers, fears, and long-buried truths as they watched their king shake violently on the ground. Even the guards who once stood tall beside Arumo now hovered at a distance, gripping their spears like men suddenly unsure whom they were defending. Jako's entrance caused a fresh ripple of murmurs, but he did not bow his head or hide his face. He had lived too many years in shadows. The time for fear had ended. What stood before them was not a rebellion, not treason, not poison, but consequence. And consequence had a strange way of walking in quietly, wearing the same face as justice that had been delayed for too long. Healer Omen knelt before the king, sniffing the cup that had been brought from Arumo's chamber, his fingers trembling as they hovered around its rim. When he rose, his voice cracked across the courtyard like thunder. "This is the herb of inner pain," he declared. "A root that does not kill, but forces the body to feel every buried wound, every hidden weakness, every cruelty turned inward." The word struck the council like a blow. Gasps followed, a wave of fear, a wave of recognition. Arumo, panicking, jabbed a shaking finger at Jako. "He did it," he shouted, his voice breaking into strange high pitches that made even his loyalists wince. He wanted me dead. He wanted my throne. He wanted... But the words tangled in his mouth, collapsing into an ugly cough. For the first time, the kingdom saw him not as a ruler, but as a man unraveling under the weight of his own rage. Jako stepped forward, his face calm, his body still, the courtyard falling into breathless silence. He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply spoke with the clarity of someone who had lived more pain than the king could ever imagine. "I did not touch your crown, your majesty," he said. "I never wanted your throne. I never wanted your power. I wanted only one thing, that you feel what you made others feel." His voice did not shake. It carried across the courtyard like a steady drumbeat of truth. "You took my father's life," he continued, not with a blade, but with humiliation. You thought he would bend, break, or disappear, and when he didn't, you cast him out like he was nothing. You tried to do the same to me." His gaze remained on the king, unwavering. "I did not poison you. I did not harm you. I simply gave you a mirror, and you were terrified of your own reflection." The courtyard responded with a silence deeper than fear, deeper than shock. This silence belonged to recognition. The council exchanged looks heavy with an understanding that none could ignore. The king's downfall had not been engineered by betrayal. It had arrived through truth. Arumo tried to rise, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing onto his side as a collective gasp surged through the courtyard. His breath hitched. His nails scraped against the stone floor. No one rushed to help him, not even his most loyal guard. That was the moment the council reached its decision. Elder Mara stepped forward, her robe sweeping across the ground like a slow-moving tide. "King Arumo," she declared, her voice firm, steady, and stripped of all fear. "This kingdom cannot be led by a man whose cruelty has brought ruin upon himself and shame upon the throne." Her words hung in the air, sharp as a blade. "By the authority of the council," she continued, "you are hereby removed as ruler in Korra." A roar of whispers rose from the crowd. Some cried with relief, others with shock, but not a single voice protested. Arumo screamed, a desperate, choking sound. But his cries were drowned beneath the weight of a kingdom finally exhaling after years of quiet suffering. The guard stepped forward, taking him not as a king, but as a captive of his own crimes. And then all eyes turned to Jako, who stood silently with his hands at his sides. Elder Mara faced him. "You lifted no weapon," she said. "You shed no blood. You exposed the truth without harming the innocent." Then, with a voice that carried strength without arrogance, she added, "From this day, you will serve not as a servant, not as a victim, but as custodian of this palace, a protector of its people, a keeper of its justice." Jako bowed his head, not in submission, but in acceptance. "Revenge," he said softly, "is complete only when cruelty ends." And the courtyard, still trembling with the echo of a fallen king, felt, for the first time in years, like a place where healing could begin. The healing did not begin with drums, celebrations, or sudden joy. It began with a quiet morning after the storm. The sun rose over Korra like a soft apology, washing light over the courtyard, where King Arumo had been taken away only hours earlier. The stones still remembered the trembling of his fall, but today they also held the footprint of change. Servants who once walked with bent spines now lifted their heads, unsure but hopeful. Guards who had once feared their own shadows now breathed more easily. The council moved to the palace not with urgency, but with a kind of cautious optimism, as though they were stepping through a house that had been locked in darkness for too long. Jako stood at the doorway of the palace storehouse, the same place where he had lived, worked, and suffered for years. Yet the air felt different now, lighter, almost unfamiliar. He did not rush to claim his new position or assert his new authority. Instead, he touched the wooden frame with the tips of his fingers, remembering every bruise, every humiliation, every night he had spent whispering to himself that he would rise again. Now he had risen, not by violence or murder, but by confronting a tyrant with truth. Some servants gathered around him, hesitantly at first, not knowing if they were allowed to approach him in this new reality. One elderly cook who had watched Arumo beat Jako years ago stepped forward with trembling hands and said, We are glad you stayed alive." Jako smiled gently, not proud, not triumphant, but grateful in a quiet, grounded way. "We all stayed alive," he replied. "Now we must learn to live." And the cook nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. It was the first time in years that someone inside the palace had cried from relief, not fear. But even as healing began to take root, the kingdom needed direction, structure, leadership rooted not in cruelty but in wisdom. The council called a gathering in the great hall, inviting elders, village heads, royal advisors, and even a few common citizens. The hall, once a chamber of King Arumo's rage, now felt strangely open, as though its walls could finally breathe again. Jako attended not as a servant in the background, but as the newly appointed custodian, standing beside the council rather than behind them. Elder Mara addressed the hall with a steady voice. "This kingdom does not need another king right now. It needs time. Time to repair, time to rethink, time to heal the wounds that one man's anger carved into our hearts." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. Decisions were made. Taxes would be lowered for a season. The prisons would be reviewed for wrongful punishment. The villages would receive support to recover from years of neglect. And the palace guards would undergo new training based not on fear, but discipline and honor. Every promise written felt like a small door opening toward a better future. Through it all, Jako remained silent, watching, listening, understanding the depth of the responsibility that had shifted onto the shoulders of the kingdom, onto his own shoulders as well. Later, as he walked through the palace corridors, he noticed things he had never seen before. The cracks in the marble pillars, the broken lamps left unfixed, the neglected tapestries gathering dust. It struck him that a palace could be as wounded as the people living in it, and healing a kingdom meant healing its walls, its halls, its heart. That evening, Jako stood on the balcony overlooking Korra as the torches lit up one by one across the city. Children chased each other in the streets for the first time past sunset. Merchants reopened their stalls. For the first time in years, laughter drifted upward instead of silence. And standing there, Jako realized something quietly profound. Revenge may have sparked a journey, but justice had given it meaning. His father's ghost, once a weight on his soul, now felt more like a guiding presence. Where anger had once sat, there was now clarity. Where pain had once lived, purpose now settled. In the days that followed, Jako began his duties as palace custodian, not wearing a crown, not sitting on a throne, but walking through the palace with the humility of someone who knew suffering intimately. He reinstated fair working hours for servants, gave the guards new schedules that did not break their bodies, and opened a small chamber near the courtyard as a listening room, a place where anyone in the palace could come and speak their concerns without fear. At first, only a few dared to approach, but soon the room became a space where truth could breathe. Council members often visited him, seeking his insight, valuing his lived experience more than ceremonial titles. Slowly, the palace transformed, not into a place of grandeur, but into a place of honesty. One morning, as Jako swept the steps near the northern gate, a habit he never fully abandoned despite his new rank, a young servant girl approached him. "Sir," she asked shyly, "will we ever have a king again?" Jako paused, resting the broom. "One day," he answered, "but only when the kingdom is strong enough to choose the right one." "And who will that be?" she whispered. Jako smiled softly. "Someone who knows pain," he said. "Someone who knows kindness. Someone who sees people, not servants." The girl nodded slowly, as though memorizing each word. As she walked away, Jako looked out at the kingdom spreading before him. Hills glowing in morning light, the river glimmering like a slow-moving silver thread, the villages waking with hope rather than dread. For the first time in his life, he felt fully aligned with the world around him, not above it, not beneath it, simply part of it. And that night, standing once more in the courtyard where the king had fallen, Jako whispered a final farewell. Not to Arumo, not to vengeance, but to the boy he had once been, the boy who had carried every bruise alone. "You made it," he murmured. "You brought the kingdom with you." And the wind, soft and warm, carried his words into the quiet sky of a land finally learning to live again.